are literally shaping the planet.
Purpose is the only pathway to a regenerative future.
We have a choice to stay with the status quo or to change.
What is the point of trying to be just resilient when we can actually innovate?
Thanks for Shadow Ventures for hosting this event and having me. I'm very excited to be here and talking today about leasing, the leasing process, and creating efficiency within. Perfect. So let's start and dive right into it. Just a small disclaimer, I'm based out of New York, so the jargon is a bit different. When I say buildings, I mean gated communities. And if I say sometimes tenants, what I'm actually supposed to say is residents. So forgive me if that happens throughout the presentation. Just so I know, are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Talking about the leasing process, we're talking about a huge and inefficient market. Again, multifamily residential leasing. We're able to take this process and basically look at it from two different prismas. One from the renter's perspective, and the other is obviously from the landlord's or manager operator's perspective. From the landlord's perspective, from the renter's perspective, this process is just too long and frustrating. And what I personally really love about the PropTech space, and especially the leasing process, is that it's so relatable. Everyone who ever moved to a large city had this experience where they were searching for an apartment. It took them a month. They were frustrated throughout all the emails and phones, application processes. And that is the biggest problem when talking about renters. It's just too manual of a process and doesn't align with what people expect of today's technology and experiences. Obviously, when you're talking about COVID, the traditional way of showing apartments, in-person showings, doesn't align with COVID best practices and social distancing. In addition to that, when taking a look at this inefficiency from the landlord's perspective, I feel that the major difference between real estate and leasing than any other industry is how you utilize the data in order to optimize whether it's days on market or rent prices and the leasing process in general. So when talking about the landlord operator manager's perspective, there really isn't this very crucial data that is supposed to be there in order to make this process more efficient and faster. Of course, when you're talking about the process itself, there are milestones. So there is listing services that you are searching on, you're touring, you're applying, you're signing a lease. Within those milestones, or I would say in between those milestones, you are in idle. And that idle time is 99% of the time. So if you're looking for an apartment for a whole month, you're actively in contact with someone only for just an hour or like the whole process. If you were able to really concat it one against the other, you would be talking about hour or maybe a couple of hours that you would be actually working. All the rest is idle time that could be eliminated. Obviously reducing days on market. When talking about the size of this problem, we're talking about a $20 billion problem in the US alone due to the inefficiency in the leasing agent's process, the time that is being spent that they don't need to spend, talking again about agents, and taking into consideration vacancy days on market that apartments are experiencing. What's interesting about this topic also is the fact that COVID really amplified many of issues that exist within this process, and that's kind of like what I want to talk about. So I'll be talking about the challenges within the leasing process and how they should be solved in the future. So the first challenge I want to really deep dive into is marketing and comp analysis. Comp analysis, what I mean by that is the work that is done by usually a leasing agent in order to understand how much how much is an apartment or unit worth when launching that unit on market. The process, and this is the very beginning of the leasing process, again, done by agents, this process is very manual. So what happens in most cases is that you would have salespeople that would be looking at comparable properties on the market. And what's important to say here is that leasing people are not analysts. And there's a big difference in the way an analyst will tackle this problem than an unexperienced person that is trying to handle a massive amount of data in order to output how much an apartment is worth today. And what happened before COVID is that this problem existed, but wasn't as amplified as it is, because now landlords really don't know how much their units are worth. So the fact that a unit was worth $3,200 a month ago doesn't mean that it's worth $3,200 this month. And this is a very strange type of dynamic where it's not the simple math of, I know how much I rented an apartment a year ago, I'm adding 5 or 10% to it, and this is how much I'm presenting it to the market this year. Now you really need to understand the market on a very intimate level. And the tools these people have in order to do this comp analysis are super limited. You have Zillow, you have StreetEasy when talking about New York. They do provide you some sort of solution, but it's very minimal, and it absolutely does not utilize the vast amount of data that they have on their back end. What I mean by that is that you're not really able to do cohesive searches in order to find comparable items on market or just were leased a few days ago. In most cases, what would happen is the agent will search for an apartment 2-bedroom because it's a 2-bedroom, washer dryer and unit because it's a washer dryer and unit, but they won't be able to search and filter on when the building was built, if there's construction over the street, or other amount of information that should be embedded into this process. StreetEasy doesn't really provide, Zillow doesn't really provide that type of data. And the data that is provided, I would say it's also not accurate. So the fact that an apartment was claimed to be leased for $3,200 a few days ago, this is what Zillow or the agent last put it on market for. It doesn't necessarily represent what the apartment really rented for. And again, especially during COVID, I can say that these numbers aren't really equal. So what we realize is that there's a huge problem, and this is a problem that even the largest management companies in New York or over the US, they don't have a efficient way of analyzing the data in order to present a new apartment on market. When talking about large cities specifically, there's another problem that has to do inherently with the types of platforms that exist today. So when taking a look at StreetEasy or Zillow Group's listing services, they were built in a time where the market wasn't as dynamic. That means that the way that they present listings to renters and the way they present analytics to agents isn't really effective in today's market. And what I mean by that, and this is a very straightforward example, before COVID, when you would put an apartment on market on this listing service, you would see hits of people interested in the apartment throughout a whole month. You would be able to compare how many call to actions, contact an agent buttons were pressed on this weekend compared to that weekend. And you were able to analyze the data throughout the whole month in order to get to a conclusion whether or not an apartment is overpriced or underpriced and deal with that. Right now, and especially again in large cities, you have vast amounts of inventory. So what happens is very fast, your listing is pushed down throughout the stack because everybody has inventory that they're putting on those services. And you only have a few days where your listing is effectively actually shown to those people who are looking for an apartment right now. So instead of having a whole month full of data, you just have a few days of data in which you're supposed to optimize your pricing. And obviously that doesn't happen in a month, so it wouldn't happen in just a few days. Another broken part of this system right now is the fact that the market shifted to, instead of kind of streamlining the whole process after you got a lead, the market shifted towards how do I get as many leads as possible. Again, talking about these large cities where a bunch of tenants, residents moved out of. So you have cities like New York that don't have enough leads to fill in the apartment, and agents don't mind spending capital on marketing. So it's not only that they would pay per day to put their listings on a platform such as StreetEasy, they would even promote them for $200 for 15 days. They would promote that listing and put it so to be able to gain more leads. But what happens is that every agent in the city feels the same way. They're all promoting at the same time. From Zillow's KPIs, you see a bunch of money coming in. Their KPIs are great, but actually they're not providing the service that they're supposed to provide, because all of those promoting listings are competing over the same space in a page. So instead of me showing up once every 3 pages, now I'm showing up after paying for promotion as a promoted apartment once every 10 or 20 or 50 pages of scrolling through listings. And that is another problem that has to do with the market today between marketing and comp analysis. I want to ask if there are any questions at this point. Okay, perfect, amazing. If you have any questions, feel free to write them down as I go. I promise to stop and discuss them. The second challenge I want to talk about is the biggest challenge within the leasing process. And this is what I call touring facilitation. Touring facilitation is built out of the scheduling and communication process prior to touring and the actual touring experience itself, physically going to the property, unlocking an apartment door, visiting that unit. The touring facilitation challenge is by far the largest and hardest challenge within the leasing process. And the reason it's the biggest is because 90% of a leasing agent's time is spent either throughout emails or text messages, coordinating a visit, answering very basic questions sometimes that prospects have prior to the visit, and physically attending, opening doors, and being there to facilitate the showing in person. So realizing that 90% of the time of an agent is spent there, this is where the focus should be. The problem is that this is the only problem, the only challenge within the whole process that is not purely digital. So every other aspect of the leasing process, whether it's application, credit scoring, and lease signing, and marketing, all of those are completely digital, completely web type of solutions. Whereas here you have, or you need to have, a solution that interacts with the real world hardware. You have physically people coming in and walking through doors. This makes this problem just so much harder to deal with. What's interesting, though, is that many solutions that were built around the leasing process were built to optimize on minimal amount of showings, because showing was the most expensive resource when talking about the whole leasing process. And when you think about it, if I could say showings don't cost me nothing, I would not want to limit the amount of people that would be able to go and see the apartment. Quite the opposite. If I was able to say, I'm not paying as a manager or a landlord, I'm not paying for showings at all, I would want as many people coming in through the door in order to see my product. So the whole ecosystem, or many different parts in the ecosystem today, are actually built in order to minimize the showings and not to provide as many showings as possible. Having as many showings as possible is kind of comparing searching for an apartment to going to the mall type of experience. When you go to the mall, you know that there are a bunch of stores that are there. I don't necessarily want to buy something, or sometimes I would go to a store that is a bit above my budget, but it looks nice from outside, or the pictures look great. So I would step into that apartment, and that way I would be able to, as a landlord, to upsell my leads. So right now, all of that isn't happening, which is unfortunate. Talking about the touring facilitation phase and taking the very tip of the iceberg at the very beginning of the process, that's when somebody is interested in an apartment, sees it online, presses contact an agent. Since that, until the time that an agent will respond, it will be after 16 hours on average. That's a huge amount of time. And I would add to that about 30% of inquiries are not even responded. So you have 30% of inquiries that are just thrown into the void, and the ones that are answered after 16 hours. And the reason is because of all those inquiries coming into mail inboxes and being dealt with in a very manual fashion. Obviously, what we would want to do here is to automate with a type of bot experience this whole correspondence phase, the whole touring facilitation phase, prior to having the person visit, and ideally be able to provide that person with a way to access apartments by themselves. This is part of what we're doing at Knock, and I can tell you that using our statistics, we're able to say that people are coming physically into an apartment 16 hours after first sending that inquiry online. So by the time that a traditional agent responds for that first email, people that are able to self-tour would already be inside the unit, which obviously reduces days on market and creates a bunch of efficiency into this process. Security is key. What I mean by that is that you're providing access into properties. And in order to do that in a way that would make sense for property managers and landlords, you would have to build a system that is very secure, meaning you ideally don't want to provide lockboxes with keys that you could duplicate. You want to provide a digital key that you're able to revoke at every single second. You want to have all of this logged and analyzed in such a way that you would know if someone is potentially abusing your system. So that's a bunch of added functionality that you would want to have here in order to be able to face this challenge. And I think the biggest piece here is that access, generic access, digital access today is not a solved problem. And this is big. This is something that, unless you really dealt with building a platform that needs some sort of access, you didn't really understand how the magnitude of this problem. And what I mean by that is that there isn't one solution today in the world that provides third parties with a way to access units without dealing with a bunch of different integrations. Let's take Amazon, for example. I think that's the best example. When talking about Amazon, you're talking about one of the largest companies out there, and they're not able to access my unit, and my unit has a smart lock on the door and has a smart intercom solution. So there is a way to digitally get into my unit, but Amazon isn't able to do so because of the fragmentations of solutions that are out there, and because of the fact that they would literally need to be able to connect and integrate with so many different smart lock solutions. The other possibility is obviously working with a company like Stratus, SmartRent. These companies are growing and providing that type of API to third parties, but then you're relying on them being there. You're relying on the fact that there's internet connectivity in the unit. Obviously, their solutions cost much more because of the added value that they provide, whereas not always a landlord would want to do that whole thing, but rather just provide access for the sake of showings and the touring facilitation. this is how you would imagine it to be. You would imagine that there would be a cloud type of API that I would say I want to unlock an apartment number 3 in this building, and that platform would centralize all of the different integrations and allow me to get the relevant key or unlock the relevant lock remotely without me really needing to understand what's behind the scenes. Any questions about touring facilitation before I move forward? Okay, perfect. The third challenge I want to talk about is communication and live feedback. So starting with the marketing, going through touring facilitation, now you're in a phase where you have people that are coming into units or throughout the process, and you want to be able to automate the communication with those potential leads. And you want to be able to collect feedback in such a way that makes sense for the leasing process itself. And the first thing that is challenging here is that agents are not CRMs. In some cases, agents are utilizing CRMs. In most cases, agents that are utilizing CRMs are not doing that in the most efficient way because it's a very manual process most of the time. Agents have feelings, agents want to close deals, so they would naturally go to those low-hanging fruits, leads that are coming in that they feel more certain about. But what happens is while agents are writing down those leads that they really want to keep track of, they're missing out of a bunch of other leads that could be very relevant to closing a deal or closing a deal fast. So what happens is that you have in the best case scenario, you would have a CRM that isn't really connected to the communication phase. And in many cases, you don't really have a CRM when talking about many mom and pop type of landlords that own rental buildings in a city like New York. They won't even have a CRM for this case. So ideally, what should happen is connecting a CRM with communication and making it one. You would want emails being sent out automatically throughout the whole process. You would want a virtual agent connecting with every single lead, knowing exactly where that lead came from, what they're interested in, whether or not they came to visit the apartment, even whether or not if they were in the area of that unit. If you have an app and you're able to utilize GPS location for that, after they visit, you want to be able to automatically ask them for feedback or ask them if they want to move forward. You don't want to have an idle time due to people that are doing manual job unless it's like absolutely needed. And in most cases, it's not. Now, what happens in traditional showings is that people come into apartments and sometimes they would communicate to an agent that is there what they're thinking about the property. In most cases, they don't. I can tell you from my personal experience, in most cases, they don't feel comfortable telling a listing agent what they feel about the apartment since that agent is representing the relevant landlord and not them. So there's a bunch of data and data points that are not utilized that are crucial to improving the whole leasing process. And what I mean by that is that if you were able to collect data in such a way that is very easy, either through an app or through emails, without the manual process of asking and noting and putting it manually in a CRM, you're able to digest 10 visits. Let's say an apartment gets 10 visits, you're able to digest the feedback from those 10 visitors into a sometimes a conclusion that could help the landlord improve the leasing on the fly. So I want to show you just a few examples of how that looks like. This is just from the past few days, but you can see that, and this is, by the way, people communicating with a bot. The whole process, they communicated with the bot. There wasn't any person involved in this process. Sharon is the name of our bot. And what you can see here is that in both cases, they're talking about the fact that the entrance smelled a lot like trash. That is something that a landlord or a manager would want to know after 2 days, not after a month that an apartment is not rented. And the ability to digest those feedbacks live and present them to the relevant manager enables the manager to say, this is what I need to do, either clean the trash or put lids on them or change something with the environment in order to make it more rentable. Another example, and by the way, the examples can also be on the positive side. As you can see on the second email here, the apartment was pretty perfect. They were talking about the layout that was great and very suitable for a family with a teenage kid. This is interesting because I happened to be in an event where Greystar, SVP and Greystar was talking about the fact that they don't know what millennials want. And that makes complete sense because they don't have a system of providing them this valuable data. She was talking about the fact that they realized after years that people are not utilizing a full-size oven in the kitchen. The way that they realized that, and this is the largest, one of the largest managers in the States, they realized that people are not utilizing the oven because when they were turning over those apartments year after year, they noticed that the brochure for the oven was still in the oven, untouched. That was the way for them to realize that they're able to use or utilize that space for something else because people are not cooking in full-size ovens anymore. So having this information is crucial not only for the leasing process itself live, but also in talking about those larger landlords that have their own construction. You would want them to know how to utilize this feedback in order to build more relevant apartments moving forward. I'll stop here for questions again, if somebody wants to ask a question regarding to communication and live feedback within the leasing process. Okay, perfect. The last topic I want to talk about that has to do with challenges today with the leasing process has to do with the funnel data. Again, data right now, I'm not talking about feedback, but actual clicks, doors unlocked, type of data that you can use in order to understand how your apartment is performing. And again, this is amplified during COVID when the pricing is so dynamic. You want to really be on top of stuff like this in order to say, or in order to prevent your apartment or unit from being on market for months and months. Right now, managers can't see a live view of what is happening. How many impressions did they get? And what I mean by impressions is how many times their listing was scrolled through a search on Zillow. How many clicks did people click on that apartment to see the whole view of that apartment? How many people sent an inquiry? How many of those actually visited the apartment? And how many of those applied for that apartment? And every single piece of data is also connected to a lead that I can say where that lead came from, what's the demographics. I can learn a bunch just from looking at the data and saying, you know, students are 90% more likely to close an apartment than another type of population that I'm dealing with. So then I would be able to focus on students. I'm able to gain much more leads from this marketplace rather than this one or Facebook compared to Zillow. These types of questions are very, very basic questions when you're talking about a B2C company that is doing marketing and optimizing their marketing efforts. They want to know what's the cost of acquisition for a lead that comes in through the funnel. when talking about real estate, you don't have that type of conversation, although you should, because optimizing these things could really make a big difference at the end of the day when talking about your marketing expenses or your ability to bring in leads, quality leads into your funnel. So what I'm talking about is can also demonstrate, for example, that the pictures that were taken for a specific apartment are not ideal. So if I'm able to say with a certain level of certainty that the pricing for a unit is good, but I see a lot of impressions but not a lot of clicks, then most likely that would dedicate that the problem is in the pictures and the photos that are on the unit, and that is just so much. That alone is so effective because it really changes the very top of the funnel. So having that type of data and analyzing it in a sophisticated way will allow landlords and managers to really make a boost in their process. Amazing. Perfect. Just to talk a bit about what we're doing, we are optimizing the leasing process, dealing with a lot of the things that we were talking about today. I hope you have a better understanding of the challenges that the leasing process has and how companies like ourselves are facing those challenges and trying to create a seamless, fast, and efficient leasing process for property managers and landlords. Thanks a lot, and I want to thank again Shadow Ventures for hosting this event and for having me.